I am sure everybody else is pretty excited for this evening. So I just wanted to start on sharing a couple of technical items for Zoom tonight to make sure that we all are good to go for this evening. There is closed captioning that is available. And if at any point you would like to turn it on, you should see on the Zoom toolbar a CC button, and you can click that at any point, and you can also turn it off or hide it at any point. Tonight's presentation is also going to be recorded because you can find it after, give us about a week, I would say, but you will find this presentation on our CCM Legacy Project YouTube page. Due to the size of the audience, everybody was muted upon entry, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. We absolutely do. There will be a Q&A session at the end of today's event, and there will be two ways that you can ask your question. If you want to ask your question directly, you can just type the word question into the chat box, and when we prompt you, you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask your question out loud. Or if you don't want to ask your question out loud and you prefer that I moderate that question for you, you can just type in your whole question into the chat box and we'll ask it for you. And we will try to get to as many questions as we can. If you want to have your name displayed, you can do so and change that at any time or put your preferred pronouns. You can do this in two ways. You can go to the participant list, find your name, hover over it, select more, and then rename yourself. Or if you just find your little face tile in the top right corner with the three dots, you can click on it and then you'll find an option for rename. Tonight's event is primarily brought to us by CCM's Legacy Project Signature Series, but it is also co-sponsored by CCM's Parks program as well. And before we hand it over and start tonight's event, I did want to mention that mark your calendars, or you can take a little screenshot of this if you'd like. We do have some great events in the next few weeks here. On Thursday, this Thursday, March 3rd, we have Professor Deborah Hofflinger, who is going to share on the life of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. On Tuesday of next week, on March 8th, we have Nashville's Torres Music Group. That following Thursday, we have Passion to Purpose and all about the climate movement and interdisciplinary looks at the climate movement. And then we also have another event on March 22nd with Dr. Nancy Unger, looking at Beyond Nature's Housekeepers and really focused on American women in environmental history. If you want any information on any of these events, or if you would like to RSVP, you can do so by just contacting legacy@ccm.edu. Now I will hand it over to my friend, Dottie Salinas, who will introduce our guest for this evening.
Thank you, Samantha. As an environmental educator myself, it is my immense honor to present tonight's speaker, Mr. Bill McKibben. Mr. McKibben is an esteemed environmentalist, author, educator, and journalist that has written extensively on the impact of global climate change. His first book, entitled The End of Nature, was an eye-opening, groundbreaking book in the field of environmental studies. The book issued a pertinent warning of the potential dangers of human impact on the natural world and has since appeared in 24 different languages. Since then, he has continued to write numerous other books and publications for the New York Review of Books, National Geographic, and Rolling Stone. Mr. McKibben is highly regarded as the Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College and is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2013, he received the Gandhi Prize and the Thomas Merton Prize and holds honorary degrees from 18 colleges and universities. In 2014, he was awarded the Right Livelihood Prize, sometimes referred to as the Alternative Nobel, which is an international award to honor and support those offering practical and exemplary answers to the most urgent challenges facing us today. He is a founder of 350.org, the first planet-wide grassroots climate change movement, which has organized 20,000 rallies around the world in every country except for North Korea. They've spearheaded the resistance to the Keystone Pipeline and launched the fast-growing fossil fuel divestment movement. The magazine Foreign Policy named him to their inaugural list of the world's 100 most important global thinkers. And the Boston Globe said he was probably America's most important environmentalist. The Legacy Project, CCM, and I could not agree more. With great admiration, I now present to you Mr. Bill McKibben.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and what a pleasure to get to join all of you today. Look, I did write the first book about climate change back when I was in my 20s, and I've spent my life dealing with this crisis, so you would be correct in assuming that I know how to depress an audience. Sometimes I think that my main work in the world is just being a professional bummer outer of people. But that's not what we're going to start tonight. There's enough terrible things happening this week in our world that it might make sense to begin by looking for where some of the promise and solution might lie. And that's really what I want to talk about, at least at the start. We'll get to some of the bad stuff. The most interesting thing and promising thing that's happened on our planet in the last 10 years is that scientists and engineers have dramatically and quickly reduced the cost of renewable energy. All of a sudden, for the very first time, using the sun and the wind and the batteries to store the power they produce is the cheapest way of generating energy on planet Earth. It's a remarkable, remarkable shift, and one we haven't quite yet fully internalized because we've all grown up in a different world where oil and gas are the things that we're used to. And it will take a little while, though hopefully not very long, because we don't have very long, for us to understand just what a lucky position we're in. The cheapest way to make power on Earth is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. And that's an incredible, incredible change. So that's where I'm going to begin. We're actually at the point where we could imagine over the next few years deciding to basically end combustion, large-scale combustion on planet Earth. Humans have been burning things for 200,000 years at least. Darwin said that alongside language, fire was the most important thing that humans had ever come up with. At the very beginning, it's what allowed us to cook our food, which in turn changed the size of our bodies and the size of our brains. It allowed us to expand out of the warm places of the world into the colder ones. It even produced, the sociologists think, the thing that started bringing us together in groups, the fact that at night we could gather around this fire and stare into it. As the last couple of centuries went on and we learned to tame that fire in other ways, as we learned to burn oil and gas and coal, it basically produced modernity for us. All the things that we understand about the world, the fact that you don't have to go to bed at the minute it gets dark, the fact that you can travel outside the village where you were born easily, that you have mobility of that kind, the fact that it's easy to keep your house at the same temperature all the year round, on and on and on. All these things we owe to the combustion of fossil fuel. The problem is, as we'll get to in a minute, that continued combustion is bringing us lots of problems, which is why it's very good news that we can move in a new direction and quickly. There are already a few countries on Earth that have managed this trick of going to 100% renewable energy, using hydropower, wind power, solar power to get entirely off fossil fuels. And more are doing it all the time. Everyone's capable of doing it. Mark Jacobson, the Stanford professor whose lab is the center of this revolution in many ways, has produced plans for every country on earth and every state in the union about how they could be at 100% renewable energy by 2030 or 2035. And a massive new study that came out a few months ago from Oxford in England made it clear that this would save the planet 20 to 30 trillion dollars if we do it quickly. So that's a dose of good and powerful and important news. And it reshapes away from despair some of the other conversations we need to have. We need to do this for, well, three big reasons that I will describe. One of them, the one we talk about the least, but maybe most direct, is simply that the combustion of fossil fuel kills an extraordinary number of people each year just from having to breathe the pollution that it causes. The combustion of fossil fuel produces particulates. When we breathe them in, they make us sick. And of course, the people who get to breathe in most of them are the poorest people on the planet. Rich people don't live near coal-fired power plants or right by the highway or whatever it is. The studies from the most recent studies from last year, and they're quite large studies, indicate that about 9 million people a year die from breathing the combustion products of fossil fuel. That's more than die from HIV/AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, COVID, war, terrorism combined each year. It's at least one death in 5 on planet Earth. And all of it's unnecessary because we have the technologies, the solar panels, the wind panels, the electric vehicles, the electric heat pumps to heat your house, to get rid of all that combustion, to stop burning things. So that's reason one. Reason two, we're seeing in high relief this week. The war that Vladimir Putin is waging in the Ukraine, brutal and thuggish war, is not a war for oil and gas. That's not why he went into the Ukraine. In that way, it's different from some of the wars that we've waged in the Mideast. But it is a war about oil and gas. The reason that Vladimir Putin has enough money to field a big army with a lot of missiles is because he sells an immense amount of oil and gas. It's the second biggest producer on Earth. 60% of his export earnings come from oil and gas. Basically, that's the Russian economy. John McCain, the late American senator from Arizona, once described Russia as basically a gas station with nukes. And that's correct. That's, if you look around your house, you'll find almost nothing else that was made in Russia unless you have a bottle of high-end vodka in the liquor cabinet. That's about it. Not only is that the thing that funds his war, it's his main weapon. He's been able to coerce the people of Western Europe for 2 decades into silence because he keeps threatening to cut off the supply of gas to Western Europe. Tells Germans and French and Italians that they'll freeze in their homes unless he does what he wants. And it's also the reason that we're fighting the war with one hand kind of tied behind our back. The Biden administration and the European Union have done a lot of important and significant things in the last few days, cutting down on the ability of Russia to use the banking system, for instance. But the thing they haven't done yet is embargo Russia's exports of oil and gas. And the reason that they haven't, even though it would deeply damage their ability to wage war, is because they're afraid that it would raise the price of gas in the US or elsewhere high enough that Americans would lose their stomach for taking on this dictator. So if Europe or the world didn't depend on oil and gas, People like Putin would be in no position to do things like that. And it's not only Putin. The fact that oil and gas are very unequally distributed around the world, that they exist in just a few places, means that the people who control those supplies end up with inordinate amounts of power. And so that's what happens. That's why people pay attention to Vladimir Putin. It's why people pay attention to the royal family of Saudi Arabia, not because they have some interesting ideas about the world. They're cut off the heads of their critics with swords. But they have the world's largest supply of oil beneath their sand, so they get far more power than they deserve. In our country, you may have heard of the Koch brothers. Our biggest oil and gas barons control many of the pipelines that take fossil fuel around the continent. They became among the richest people in America, and they used that money to buy a political party, the Republican Party, where they became by far the biggest donors. And in return, they've been able to use that control to do all kinds of things that many of us think are malign and racist and wrong in this society. The point of all of this is that if we move away from fossil fuel to sun and wind, we're moving to commodities that aren't concentrated in a few places. Everyone has some sun. Everybody has some wind. Nobody will be able to control the supply and in the process become powerful in quite that same way. Yes, there will be solar millionaires and billionaires, but nobody can cut off the supply of the sun, you know. Vladimir Putin has no way to stop the wind from blowing across Europe. And so we very much need to make this transition for that second reason. The third reason, of course, trumps them all. And that's the fact that we simply must change because if we don't, this planet is, well, it's not going to resemble the one we were born onto and in very, very, very dire and grim ways. Yesterday morning, in the middle of all this, middle of all the horrors from the Ukraine, came another set of horrors, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is the group of climate scientists that gather together around the world to assess the state of global warming, issued their most recent report. It's 6,000 pages long, but you can sum it up by saying we are in deep and real hot water. What they pointed out was that so far we have raised the temperature of the Earth just over 1 degree Celsius, so just almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit, which does not sound like very much. If it's 30 degrees in New Jersey right now and it's 28 degrees tonight and you walk outside, you won't be able to tell the difference. Your body can't take that in, but the planet can understand the difference. The extra heat that we trap each day because of the carbon that we've put in the atmosphere by burning coal and gas and oil, that extra heat is the heat equivalent of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic explosions. When you consider it in those units, you begin to understand how we've been able to melt most of the sea ice in the summer Arctic. And having melted most of the sea ice in the summer Arctic, we've managed, for instance, to deform the path of the jet stream, the air currents that take heat from the equator and distribute it to the poles. The differential in heat between the poles and the equator is smaller than it used to be. And as a result, that jet stream gets deformed, misshapen, and we get these long periods of either drought or flood, depending on which side we're on. That melt in the Arctic has pushed huge amounts of fresh water into the North Atlantic. And in turn, that's apparently begun to dramatically slow the Gulf Stream, the current of warm water that runs from the equators again up to the poles. It's a big river, that Gulf Stream, about 100 times the flow of the Amazon, but it's been reduced its flow by about 15% in the last few decades as those fresh water pours into the top, reducing the density differences that cycle that water, that great conveyor belt around the earth. One could go on all day about things like this. I'm just trying to tell you that even at this point, we've begun to break very fundamental systems on planet Earth, and we can see it all around us. If you wanted one fact to help you understand the 21st century, you could do worse than warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That means that in arid, dry areas, think California, we get much more evaporation very quickly. And so things dry out, and when they get dry and when they get hot, they catch on fire. That's why we've seen wildfires of a kind that we've never observed on this planet before, not just in California, in Australia, in parts of Europe, probably most dangerously across huge swaths of Siberia, up along the boreal forest of the far north, where they pour extraordinary amounts of carbon back into the air, amplifying this whole big feedback loop. Once that water is evaporated into the air, it then comes down. The residence time for a molecule of water vapor in the atmosphere is only about a week. And that means that when it comes down in wet areas like the ones we live in, it tends to come down in much bigger quantities than we've ever observed before. I was in New York City in August when the greatest rainfall that had ever fallen in New York City took place as the remnants of Hurricane Ida blew through. We've been measuring rainfall in New York City for 160 years, and this smashed all the old records. In fact, the record that it smashed had been set 11 days earlier, to give you some sense of how fast and how crazy these things are becoming. That rainfall was truly spectacular. I mean, I remember being at the 28th Street subway station and watching the water cascade down onto the tracks. But Manhattan was not where it really did its damage. It was in parts of New Jersey, but also in the outer boroughs of New York, where people drowned in basement apartments in the richest city in the world. These were not rich people. They were in illegal basement apartments, which is the important reminder that the iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit by its results. That's always true. Let me give you another example. The summer before last, we had the biggest hurricane season in the Atlantic that we've ever had. More storms. We ran out of letters in the alphabet and we're into the Greek alphabet before we were done. And the last two storms of the year, Eta and Iota, crashed not into America, but into Central America, into the coast of Nicaragua, and then they spent most of their fury over Honduras and Guatemala. And the damage was insane. We think that in Honduras, the damage was equivalent roughly to 40% of the GDP, the gross domestic product. By comparison, the worst storm ever to hit the US, Hurricane Katrina, did damage equivalent to about 1% of our GDP. So many people in Honduras lost their farms because suddenly they were covered with a foot of sand, or they lost the bridges that they needed to cross in order to get their produce to market. What do you know? A lot of them started heading north towards our southern border to cross into the US. When they get there, I cannot tell you what their legal status will be, but I can tell you what their moral status will be. Nobody in Honduras or Guatemala did a damn thing to cause climate change. When you look at their emissions, they're a rounding error in the calculations, a tiny amount per person. Whereas the 4% of us who live in the US have produced about 25% of all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. No other country will ever come close to matching us. And that carbon that we've been putting in the atmosphere is, for decades, is going to be there for centuries. CO2 molecule lasts 100 years or more in the atmosphere. So the damage we've done will be heating the planet for a very long time ahead. That means, I think, in the most basic terms, that if a crazy storm hits Honduras and 1,000 people drown, 250 of them are on us. If there's a huge outbreak of dengue fever, mosquito-borne disease now spreading fast because mosquitoes like the warm, wet world that we're creating, if 1,000 people die, then 250 of them are on us. That's kind of crude moral math, but I think basically to the point, which should make us want to make change happen just as fast as we can. I began by telling you the biggest and most important part of that change, what we would need to do, which is replace coal and gas and oil with sun and wind and the batteries to store that power. And I began by explaining to you that it was doable, it was affordable, that we could make it happen. So now I've got to tell you the hard part, which is why we aren't doing it, at least at the pace we need. Because that pace is fast. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, whose report came out yesterday, they've told us that if we wanted to limit emissions and keep the temperature from going up more than 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, we'd have to cut our emissions in half by about 2030, which is 7 years and 10 months away as of today. Not very long time. Why aren't we scrambling with everything we have to do this? Well, the biggest reason, and the biggest reason by far, is that there are some people in power on this planet who do not want it to happen. The fossil fuel industry was the biggest industry on Earth, certainly when we started in on this process 30 years ago. And we now know from tremendous investigative reporting that the fossil fuel industry knew everything there was to know about climate change all the way back in the 1980s. When I was writing that first book, it turns out they were studying this question hard too. And you would think they would, because, well, you know, I mean, Exxon was the biggest company on planet Earth then. It had a huge set of scientists, and their product was carbon. So of course they were going to study it and find out what was going on. And those scientists were good, and they figured out what was happening, and they told their executives what was happening. We now know from whistleblowers and from going in archives that the predictions they made, for instance, about what the temperature would be in 2020 were spot on. They knew what was coming. And they were believed. When the scientists told the executives at places like Exxon this, they started doing things like building their drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level that they knew was in the offing. They started planning which parts of the Arctic they were going to go try and drill in once it was melted in a few decades. So they knew what was going on, but they did not tell the rest of us. Instead, beginning right about the time that book came out, right around 1990, across this industry, they got together to spend billions of dollars building this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation. They went and hired the people who used to work for the tobacco industry, and they set them to work trying to do the same trick they'd done there, convince people that the science wasn't settled, that we didn't really know what was going on and on and on. They spent billions of dollars doing this, and they were successful in doing it. They took us from a world where taking on these questions was a bipartisan, obvious thing to do. In 1988, when we were first talking about what we then called the greenhouse effect, the Republican president of the United States, George H.W. Bush, pledged that he would fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect, as he put it, which was a pretty good line. And he, I'm sure, meant it. 30 years later, after all that lying, the Republican president of the United States, one Donald Trump, declared that climate change was a hoax invented by the Chinese, a sentiment so bizarre that if somebody next to you on the PATH train was muttering that, you'd probably get up and change seats, you know? But that's what happens when you have 30 years and billions of dollars to tell a lie. And that lie turns out to be the most consequential lie in human history because it cost us the one thing we could least afford to lose, which was time. It's why we're so far behind the 8 ball now. You have to remember always that one of the things that makes climate change so distinctive is it's a timed test. Most of the political questions we have to deal with, you know, we come back and forth on over and over and over again. Are we going to do national health care? Well, we'll do a little bit. We'll call it Obamacare. We'll go a little further. And maybe 10 years later, we'll go a little further than that. And sort of that's how it works. You make some progress. That's not how it works with climate change. If we don't solve it soon, we never solve it, because once you melt the Arctic, nobody's got a plan for how you go melt it, how you go freeze it back. This is a timed test, and that's why we're in such trouble. The fact that the fossil fuel industry put up this massive resistance to change is the reason that we've had to build massive movements to try and slow them down. And that's what I've spent much of my life doing, volunteering in these efforts to try and hold them to account. And those efforts have been increasingly successful. With 7 college students, a dozen years ago, I founded a group called 350.org. It became the first iteration of a large-scale climate movement. It takes its strange name from what the scientists tell us is the most carbon we could safely have in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million, a number we're sadly already way north of, which is why the Arctic is melting or California catches on fire. 350.org helped start the fight against the Keystone Pipeline, and it helped start this massive fossil fuel divestment campaign that's become the biggest anti-corporate campaign of its kind in history. Earlier today, we had a celebration of sorts to mark the fact that we've gone past the $40 trillion mark in endowments and portfolios that have decided to divest their holdings from fossil fuel. And the institutions that have done that include huge pension funds, New York City, New York State. I believe the New Jersey pension fund is weighing the possibility at the moment, and I hope you'll press them to do it. It includes some of the great educational institutions on earth, Rutgers for one, Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, the University of California system, the University of Michigan system, on and on and on. And that has put big pressure on the fossil fuel industry, made it harder for them to raise money that they need. We need to continue this kind of work and push it as hard as we can. And you'll see that one of the best things that's happened in the course of these last years is that more and more and more young people have gotten deeply involved in this work. It was young people who pushed this fossil fuel divestment campaign on college campuses. And then when many of these young people got out of college, then they went to work building what's called the Sunrise Movement. These are the people who brought us the Green New Deal. And that's kind of morphed into this Build Back Better bill that President Biden has been trying so hard to pass. It's difficult because the fossil fuel industry is in the way. Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, the Democrat who's so far held up the passage of that act, has taken more money from the fossil fuel industry than anybody else in Washington, which is not an easy contest to win. But their money was well spent because by buying him off, they've produced obstruction that keeps us from doing what we need to do. But those young people have been incredible. And so have the young people, even younger people who followed them, the high school students and the junior high school students who rallied, many of them behind the wonderful Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg is one of my favorite people on earth. There's no one I like working with more, but she would be the first to tell you that the really good news is that there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs, and they have 10 million followers all across the earth. And together they're doing extraordinary work. But it's not okay, neither morally nor practically, to take the most difficult problems on earth and just assign them to, high school students and college students to solve. Other people need to join in too. And I hope that you will tell your parents and your grandparents about the work we're now doing at an organization called Third Act, which is designed to organize people over the age of 60 to take on these questions. And people over the age of 60 can have some real impact too, because, among other things, they vote like crazy, so they have lots of political power, and fairly or not, they ended up with most of the money. The baby boomers and the silent generation above them have 70% of the country's financial assets, compared with 5% for millennials. Why is that important? It's because one of the levers that we've got to pull, one of the groups that we've got to push, are the big banks, because they're continuing to lend the fossil fuel industry the money that they need to keep doing what they're doing. At Third Act, we've got people signing up to a pledge to close their accounts and cut up their credit cards with Chase Bank, Citibank, Wells Fargo Bank, and Bank of America, the four big American banks who are also the four biggest lenders on planet Earth to the fossil fuel industry. They've lent them $1 trillion since the Paris Climate Accords were signed. They didn't need Donald Trump to sabotage them. They were willing to do it themselves in order to make a little bit of money. These guys are not good, and that's why we're standing up to them in all the ways that we can. And as I say, I hope you'll tell whatever geezers like me about this work that we're doing, and try to get them enlisted, because otherwise we're going to be a generation that leaves the planet a way worse place than we found it, and that's not a distinction that we want. I know it's time to stop here for questions. So let me just say one more thing, which is, we don't know if we're going to win this fight. We've waited a very long time to get started, and there's a lot of momentum behind the destruction. The fact that the Arctic is melted is not a good sign. Obviously, we're not going to stop global warming. That's no longer one of the options. Our hope is that we can still stop it short of the place where it cuts civilizations off at the knees. We've raised the temperature 1 degree. We're on a path to raise it 3 degrees Celsius at the moment. If that happens, we will not have civilizations like the ones we're used to. So all our work is to try and keep it to 2 degrees or 1.5. If we do that, it will not be a perfect world by any means, but it may be a survivable world. It may be a world where you'll be able, in the prime of your life, to work on something other than disaster response. That's why we're fighting so urgently. It's why I keep ending up having to go to jail for civil disobedience actions and things, because we need change and we need it fast. I don't know if we're going to win this fight, as I say, but I know that we have a chance. And I know, and those of you who have been working on this should take heart from the fact that you have millions and millions of brothers and sisters around the world. At 350.org, we've organized about 20,000 demonstrations in every country on earth except North Korea. And that means that I've been in motion around the planet for much of these last years. So I can tell you that on any given night like this, there'll be 1,000 meetings going on around the world where people try to figure out how they stand up and make this kind of change that we need. And if we can figure out how to aggregate that desire and hope for change, then we've got a chance. That's what we're about anyway. So I promised I'd end at 6:45 for questions, and it's think it's 6:45. So let me stop and say thank you to everyone who organized this and everybody who's been here. I've given it to you right between the eyes, so it's fine with me if you give it right back. Questions, comments, critique, abuse, whatever you have in mind. I'm open to doing it. And Samantha, are you going to handle things now? I'll turn them over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. We have questions rolling in before you even finished, and a lot of questions that are coming in. So we'll try to get to as many as we can. So my first question that came in was, you have dedicated your life to study, understand, and defend our planet. In your experience, what is the biggest hurdle we are facing? Why is it so difficult to convey the message and promote real change?
It's a good question. There's always a lot of hurdles, and inertia is a very real force. I mean, you have a big, complicated world. It's hard to make it change. There's always something else going on, so on and so forth. But the biggest problem is the one I described. The vested interest of the fossil fuel industry, the fact that they have told a very big lie for a very long time, and the fact that they're so politically connected and so wired, so gamed the system, that's the single thing that's hardest. That's why things like divestment that help to cut their political power by getting institution after institution to break ties with them are so important.
Our next question comes from, I believe you say, Brianna. Brianna, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
I
We
can.
can.
So this isn't really a question. I just wanted to say that it's really an honor for me because when I was in high school, I think in the year 2016 or 2017, I had wrote a letter to you and you responded. So this is like pretty amazing. I was just sitting in class today with my history teacher and she was telling us about you and I was like, no way, like he's speaking, this is crazy. So I wrote a letter basically just stating about my concern of, what a 15-year-old girl could do with a small voice of this huge issue, my part that I could do to be a better person for the environment. And you wrote me a really nice letter back. So I want to say thank you. That's pretty awesome. And yeah, so.
Well, Brianna, that makes me very happy to hear. Many thanks for being engaged in this work. And as you know, there's ways for everybody to get involved and pretty easily. So that really makes me happy. Thank you for that.
Thank you. All right, next is Deanna. You should be able to unmute.
So, I just wanted to know, this may sound like a simple question, but I come across many boomers and I try to explain to them the crisis that we're in, and they don't believe me. And they don't believe that they're like plastic bags will never be banned. This is all a hoax. And I don't know what to do. And I just want to know how I can help because it's really important to me.
Absolutely. So here's the thing. There are a lot of people who just are not going to get this. The good news is there's fewer of them all the time. Because people have done such good organizing, and also because because things have gotten so obvious, public opinion is shifting. So when we poll people now, because they've lived through so many fires and hurricanes and things, we find that about 70% of Americans understand that climate change is a real problem and want to do something about it. So that's good. 70% is actually quite a lot in this country to get agreeing on anything anymore. The problem, I think, is less convincing the other 30%, because I don't think they're ever going to be convinced. They've just spent too long listening to Tucker Carlson or Rush Limbaugh or whatever. I mean, past a certain point, it gets very hard to discern reality. I mean, look, we live in a country where a fair number of people won't take a free shot from the government that'll keep them from getting a deadly disease. I mean, but most people did take the shot. Most Americans did buckle down and do the things that we needed to do and protect the community and so on. And the same can happen here. the problem is not trying to get that last 30%. The problem is trying to take that 70% and get some real percentage of them engaged in doing something about it. So what I always tell people, especially in the fall, I'll always say, like, do not wreck Thanksgiving dinner, like arguing with your crazy uncle about climate change, because he's not going to shift. He's not waiting for the next, academic journal to come out with another study on climate change, and it's going his opposition is just rooted in ideology or identity, or it's just too frightening, or he loves his enormous SUV so much that he just can't bear the thought of anything being wrong with it or whatever. But do sit down next to your sweet aunt, and try to, who's probably scared about the world that her grandkids are inheriting, and try to get her to be a little more involved, to be writing the letter, to be voting the right way, or whatever it is. And as I say, with this work we're now doing with older people at Third Act, we're seeing extraordinary. I mean, I just was putting up on Twitter pictures of all these people older than me out yesterday demonstrating outside a bank in Virginia, just around it with signs, and they'll go in and get arrested in the next couple of months and things, just because they really care. So point people in the direction of any group that seems to be working. For young people, I highly recommend this Sunrise movement. There's actually a great profile of them in the New Yorker magazine last week that I recommend, and you should be able to find it easily online. And you'll get a sense of what great work they've done to help shake up our political system.
Our next question comes from Lace Santos. You should be able to unmute.
Hi, thank you. I just first want to say again, thank you so much for coming to speak to everybody. This is clearly an extremely pressing issue, and it definitely needs to be discussed. I almost wanted to kind of challenge some things, but not super challenge. I don't know, because I agree with everything that you said. But a lot of the points that you made, at the end of the day, a lot of the funding that comes from fossil fuels, it's the same, big four banks. And there's a lot of kind of talk these days about how I think it's 73% of carbon emissions come from the same three big companies, or something of that aspect. And I know everyone's asking kind of how can I help and how can I get involved as an individual? And while that's really important, I think I just get a little bit frustrated sometimes, always seeing don't use plastic straws, use reusable bags, all of those things, when in reality, the difference that those things are making is pretty minuscule compared to if you had, one of these big companies have a bigger effort put out. So maybe, I don't know if this is necessarily a question as much as
I couldn't agree with you more. No, I couldn't
Yeah.
agree with you more. Look, my house is covered with solar panels. They connect to the electric car in the driveway. I'm really happy with that, whatever. But I don't try to fool myself that that's how we're going to do this. We're past the point where you can make the climate math work one vegan dinner at a time, one Tesla at a time. The most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to change the basic political and economic ground rules. So that's precisely why we've taken on, we've done this divestment campaign, which is now, as I say, we're at $40 trillion in institutions that have sold their stock in coal and oil and gas. It's why we're taking on the four biggest banks in the world. That's not easy. That's the center. I mean, that's capital. That's when people talk about capitalism, that's the capital that's involved in it. And we have to make it change. So you're right. Don't waste. I mean, there's no reason to have a bad light bulb or to whatever. But don't waste your time making that the sole focus of your work. Figure out how to dig in deep enough that we can change the basic operation of things.
Thank you for that question and comment. Next, we have a question that, what do you think our world will be like if we don't win this war?
Well, it may not be exactly like hell, but it'll be a similar temperature. You know, we got a sense last summer of kind of what it would feel like. You may recall there were a bunch of heat waves, but the scariest one was over the Pacific Northwest in Canada in June. And the temperature went crazy. We didn't break old temperature records by a half a degree, which is what you would expect. If a record's been there for 100 years, you'll break it by a tiny amount. We were breaking temperature records by 8, 9, 10, 11 degrees. It got to 121 degrees in Canada, which was almost certainly the hottest it's been since the Pleistocene. It's hotter. It was hotter in Canada that day than it's ever been in Europe or ever been in South America. That should give you some sense of just how distorted these systems are becoming and what kind of extremes we're now able to see. So we've got to be able to head off as much of that as we can. If we can't, the results of a world where we're having crises like that all the time will be almost literally unbearable. The UN High Commission on Refugees estimates that we could, in unchecked global warming, see 1 billion climate refugees this century. So 500,000 people have flooded out of Ukraine this week, and it's been described as the largest refugee exodus in Europe, at least in this century. Multiply that by 2,000 times, and you get some sense of the scale of disruption and number of people having to leave their homes. The economists tell us that unchecked global warming, by the time you guys are my age, would cost $550 trillion, which is more money than currently exists on planet Earth. We can't let this happen. It's why we have to change so fast.
All right, we might only be able to get to a few more questions, but there's still a bunch here. So why don't we, next one, Razi Stein, if you would like, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hello there, my name is Razy Stein. Thank you so much for coming to speak today. It's an honor to actually be able to talk to you in person. I have a question, well, first a comment and a question that's a little bit controversial. You would agree that as individuals, the most change we can make is by how we spend our money. We vote with our dollar, like the choices we make. So why do you think the most impactful way a person can help fight against climate change, which is to stop eating animal products, is not more heavily stressed, especially since animal agriculture is the second largest contributor of human-made greenhouse gas emissions and is the leading cause of deforestation, which affects carbon being absorbed, water and air pollution, and biodiversity loss?
So I think it's a very good question. We think that agriculture, and of which livestock is the biggest part, account for about 18% of emissions. So it's a big number and very important. And I think the reason that people have stressed working on fossil fuels more is because it's easier to get change. So it's not easy, but maybe easier. That is to say, when we go up against Exxon and so on, they're very big and powerful, but it's a limited target set. There's 10 big companies, as Lace was saying, that produce most of the emissions. And so we have some chance of going after them, as opposed to trying to convince everybody on Earth to change their diets, which is difficult. It's not that we shouldn't try. I've just contributed the foreword to a book that'll be out next week that you might enjoy, Razy, called Meet Me Halfway, MEAT, by a wonderful guy named Brian Cateman, who's trying to persuade people to cut their consumption of animal products in half, which is a very good idea for all kinds of reasons, including our health. But don't expect it to happen really quickly. About 0.5% of Americans are vegans, for instance. So if we did an incredible amount of work, we might be able to increase that by 10 times, an order of magnitude, and that would be about 5% of Americans. So that would be helpful, but it wouldn't make a huge dent in emissions, especially on a planet where billions of people are now coming into eating meat for the very first time and liking it, to tell you the truth, in a lot of places. I'm not saying we shouldn't try it. I'm saying don't put don't rest too much hope on it happening on a scale large enough to make a huge difference really fast. I think it's one of those things that we'll be moving towards as time goes on, and it may get easier because the equivalent for solar power and wind power for meat may turn out to be these things like Impossible Burgers and Beyond Burgers and all the kind of plant-based or cell-based meat products that people are beginning to come up with. So don't give up hope on it by any means. Keep working on it. And I really would recommend this book, Meet Me Halfway, because I think this guy's done a terrific job, and I was proud to get to write the foreword for it.
All right, thank you so much.
And if it's all right, we'll have one final question.
Please.
Okay, and it's coming from our friends at Kane University. There, we have some faculty and a bunch of students there together that would like to know, why haven't businesses invested in more environmentally friendly activities?
Well, I mean, businesses are definitely beginning to. The one way to ask this question is, why didn't the oil companies, when they knew all about climate change, decide that they were going to get way ahead of the game and invest huge amounts of money in solar and wind so they'd own the energy future? And the answer is interesting. Yes, you can make plenty of money doing solar stuff. There's going to be lots and lots of jobs putting up solar panels and so on and so forth. But you can't make as much money as you could make from selling fossil fuel. And if you think about it, the reason becomes obvious. Exxon has made its fortune because every month or every time you go to the gas station or something, you have to hand over some more money to them. You give them some money and they give you some oil. But with renewable energy, with say a solar panel, you pay once to put it up. But once you've put it up, well, the sun delivers the power for free every morning when it rises above the horizon. And if you're Exxon or the Koch brothers or Vladimir Putin or someone, you think that's the worst business model there ever was. I hate that. That's going to cost me a fortune. And that's why they've spent a fortune making sure that it's slowed down, isn't happening fast. It's truly sad that that's what's happened, because it's going to cost us extraordinary hardship and damage. But there's no point at this point crying over what's happened already. Now the point is to try and make change happen fast enough, to try and break the political power of the Exxons of the world, of the Putins of the world, of the Koch brothers of the world, so they can't hold off this change any longer. That's why we need to organize. That's why we need to divest. That's why we need to pass new laws. That's why we need people engaged together in this fight. And that's why it's been such a pleasure to get to be with you all, to say thank you to those of you who've already been engaged in this work, and to thank the rest of you in advance for the work that I'm sure you'll do in the years ahead as we're doing this. And Brianna, I see your question, and it's the key question. You can join, you can go to Sunrise Movement, just Google it and you'll find it, and you can send your parents to thirdact.org and get them engaged, or actually in your guys' case, your grandparents to thirdact.org and get them fired up. Among other things, you may find it easier to get your grandparents than your parents' attention, because they're reaching the point in their lives when they're really beginning to wonder what legacy they're leaving behind. And that's a good question for all of us to be thinking about all the time. thank you guys enormously. This has been a real pleasure, and I'll look forward to seeing you down the road.
I will say on behalf of the Legacy Project, CCM, and the wider community, thank you for sharing your experiences, your insights with all of us tonight. We can definitely see by all the questions and the interest that this was extremely valuable for everyone. And thank you for everyone in the audience that attended this evening's event. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Good night.